Two German Shepherd puppies stood side by side beneath the bright training yard lights. One followed every command, winning praise with each confident step. The other stayed quiet, watching everything, and failing every test placed before her. Navy SEAL Michael Turner had been given one simple order: choose the puppy worth keeping. But what if the strongest candidate was not the one everyone applauded? And what would happen when Michael realized the quieter puppy was being judged by a test never designed to understand her? With only one place available, could he make a fair decision without changing both of their lives? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Early spring had settled over northeastern Florida with warm rain, pale clouds, and a salt, heavy wind from the Atlantic. The training facility outside Jacksonville looked almost too clean beneath the washed gray sky. Clipped grass, white fences, concrete runs, and observation windows reflecting everyone behind them. Michael Turner arrived carrying a waterproof notebook and the kind of stillness people often mistook for calm. At 41, the Navy SEAL stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders and lean at the waist. His dark brown hair was cut close, with gray beginning near one temple. A neatly trimmed beard sharpened his angular face, and a thin, pale scar crossed his chin from an old training accident. Michael was courteous but rarely warm. He listened carefully, spoke directly, and trusted measurable results more than impressions. Years earlier, he had challenged a poor evaluation of a young working dog, insisting instinct mattered more than numbers. The dog later failed certification, and Michael carried the mistake as proof that intuition was pride wearing softer clothes. Captain Thomas Reed met him beside the puppy yard. Thomas was a compact 50-year-old officer with sandy hair, a square jaw, and a habit of tapping his pen whenever money entered a conversation. Reduced funding meant only one of two 11-week-old female German Shepherd puppies could remain in the specialized program. Michael had 6 weeks to choose, though Thomas clearly expected an obvious answer much sooner. Maisie appeared first. She was slightly larger, with a rich black saddle, bright tan legs, oversized paws, and ears that rose before tipping outward. Maisie rushed toward every person as though applause were oxygen. She chased a ball, climbed an unstable platform, recovered when a metal bowl clattered, and returned to Michael with her whole body wagging. Ruby came next. He had similar coloring, but a narrower face, darker fur around the eyes, and one ear folded at the tip. Ruby did not retreat. She studied. She watched the handler's hands, the observers, the open gate, and the shadow of a palm frond moving across the ground. When Michael called, Ruby took 3 steps, noticed several people leaning closer, and stopped. The first assessment measured response to motion, willingness to cross a new surface, recovery after distraction, and interest in human direction. Maisie completed every task quickly, sometimes carelessly, but always with enthusiasm. Ruby placed one paw on a low bridge and withdrew when the observers shifted behind the glass. Michael repeated the cue. Ruby sat down. During the scent box exercise, Maisie pushed her nose into every opening until one produced food. Ruby sniffed the first box, glanced toward the camera above the course, and turned away before reaching the correct one. Michael felt irritation before curiosity. People like to praise quiet intelligence, yet most systems rewarded the creature willing to display it immediately and in public. Michael knew that, but he also believed working conditions would not become gentle simply because an animal needed time. A specialized working dog might one day face strange rooms, unfamiliar hands, hard surfaces, and people waiting for an answer. The world rarely asked whether a creature felt ready before demanding that it perform. By noon, Maisie's sheet carried strong marks. Ruby's contained words that sounded neutral but could shape a life. Hesitant, environmentally sensitive, low engagement under observation. Michael marked Maisie as high potential. Beside Ruby, he wrote unsuitable for specialized placement. Ruby slept beneath a bench while he finished, her nose tucked under her tail, unaware that a sentence had just been placed over her future. Michael drove south to St. Augustine after the session. For the assignment, he had rented a room from Margaret Ellis, a 72-year-old retired bridal seamstress whose narrow blue house stood beneath live oaks and Spanish moss. Margaret was tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair cut to her jaw, freckled skin, and long hands swollen at the knuckles by arthritis. Her blue eyes were clear and uncomfortably observant. She wore linen trousers, soft shirts, and a measuring tape around her neck even when she was not sewing. Margaret's humor was dry, and her hospitality practical. She had spent 40 years making brides feel beautiful while learning that gratitude and fairness were not the same thing. She did not ask Michael personal questions when he moved in. She showed him the room, told him which floorboard complained after midnight, and warned him that the back gate required lifting before it would close. Linda Parker was in the sewing room when Michael arrived. At 68, Linda was softly built, with carefully styled auburn gray hair, smooth ivory skin, and the polished manner of someone accustomed to being welcomed. She was preparing to marry again after 12 years of widowhood. 30 years earlier, Linda had been Margaret's business partner. When a magazine praised Linda for a bridal design Margaret had created, Linda had remained silent. That silence helped Linda's career and ended their partnership. It was not the sort of betrayal that made dramatic noise. No doors had slammed, no one had shouted in public. Linda had simply allowed the wrong name to remain beneath a photograph, and Margaret had learned that a person did not need to tell a lie to live comfortably inside one. Now Margaret was completing one final wedding gown for her. The bodice used cool white silk, but the original material had run out, forcing Margaret to finish part of the skirt with a warmer, ivory-white fabric. The difference was slight, but visible where the light touched both pieces. Linda wanted the seam hidden. "People will see it in photographs," she said, pinching the fabric between two carefully manicured fingers. Margaret adjusted the dress on its padded form. "People usually see whatever they have already decided to criticize." Linda pressed her lips together. Michael stood near the doorway, feeling that he had entered the middle of an argument that had been continuing silently for 3 decades. Neither woman mentioned the magazine article. They spoke about hems, shadows, and how the fabric would look outdoors because people often built entire polite conversations around the one sentence they could not yet bear to say. That evening, Michael received permission to bring Maisie and Ruby to the house for off-site observation. He carried 2 crates through the back door while Margaret cleared pins from the sewing room floor. Maisie burst into the room and discovered that wooden spools rolled beautifully across hard wood. She chased a ribbon beneath a chair, knocked over a basket of lace, and emerged wearing a loop of tulle over one ear like a tiny, extremely proud bride. Michael almost smiled. Ruby entered slowly. She paused at the doorway, studying the sewing machine, the mirrored cabinet, the hanging fabric, and Margaret standing several feet away without reaching for her. Margaret did not call Ruby's name. She did not crouch or clap her hands. She simply returned to sorting thread, leaving the choice untouched. Ruby crossed the room. She settled beneath the unfinished gown and rested her chin directly on the warmer piece of cloth, the section Linda wanted hidden. Margaret picked up Michael's evaluation sheet from the table. Her eyes moved over Maisie's high marks and stopped at Ruby's recommendation. "You met her today," Margaret said. "And you have already decided the rest of her life?" Michael looked toward Ruby. The puppy's eyes were open, watching the room from beneath the 2 shades of white. "A test has to reach a conclusion," he said. Margaret smoothed the fabrics where they met. "No," she said. "It only tells you who is good at doing what the person who wrote the test expected." The first full week of evaluation began beneath a clear Florida sky, with warm wind moving through the pines beyond the training field, and the wet earth still carrying the scent of the previous night's rain. Michael Turner arrived before the handlers had finished placing the obstacles. He liked the facility best at that hour, when no one was yet performing for anyone else, and every sound had a purpose. A latch closing, water filling metal bowls, paws moving across concrete. By mid-morning, the place would become louder, brighter, and less honest. Maisie did not seem troubled by that transformation. The 11-week-old German Shepherd puppy treated attention like sunlight. The moment a handler stepped into the yard with a ball, Maisie's whole body sharpened with anticipation. Her black and tan coat gleamed beneath the morning light, and her large paws struck the ground with more confidence than coordination. He raced through a fabric tunnel, scrambled over a low wooden platform, and returned to Michael with her ears unevenly raised and her tongue hanging from one side of her mouth. When the observers laughed, Maisie moved faster. When someone clapped, she lifted her chest as if praise had physical weight and she intended to carry all of it. Michael admired that response. In his world, confidence was not merely charming, it was efficient. A working dog that recovered quickly after distraction required less reassurance, less time, and fewer adjustments from the people around it. Ruby entered the same course more slowly. Her darker face remained alert, but her attention seemed divided among too many details. The movement behind the observation window, a loose strip of canvas lifting in the wind, Thomas Reed shifting his pen from one hand to the other. Ruby stepped through the tunnel but stopped when several people leaned closer to the glass. He sat down midway through the next task and looked away from Michael. He repeated the command. Ruby's folded ear twitched. She remained seated. Maisie would have launched herself across the field for half a biscuit and the possibility of approval. Ruby seemed to notice the biscuit, evaluate the situation, and decide the price was too high. Michael wrote, "low task engagement" on the evaluation sheet. The phrase was accurate in the narrow way technical language often was. It described what Ruby had done without explaining why she had done it. Human beings trusted such phrases because they looked cleaner than uncertainty. Once behavior had been given a label, people felt less responsible for continuing to observe it. By the third day, Maisie had become the unofficial favorite of the facility. Kennel staff greeted her first. Visitors asked to watch her sessions. Even Thomas, who claimed not to become attached to animals under evaluation, carried an extra piece of chicken in his pocket. Maisie learned quickly that a room full of faces could be turned into an audience. She retrieved a cloth toy, dropped it at Michael's boots, and glanced past him toward the observation deck before he had even praised her. Ruby continued to fail in quieter ways. She sometimes completed the first half of a task and then stopped when someone approached from behind. During a simple recall exercise, she took several steps toward Michael, noticed a camera lens turning in her direction, and moved to the edge of the yard instead. Michael's conclusion grew firmer. Ruby was intelligent enough to understand the tasks, but intelligence without reliable action had limited value in the work he knew. On Friday afternoon, the evaluation team paused for lunch. Maisie and Ruby were placed in a shaded exercise area with water, toys, and 2 plastic puzzle boxes containing pieces of food. Maisie attacked the first box with immediate enthusiasm. He slapped it with both paws, bit the corners, shoved it against the fence, and barked when the lid refused to open. After several noisy attempts, she abandoned it and carried a rope toy to the nearest person instead. Ruby waited until the yard had nearly emptied. Michael remained at a table beneath the awning, completing paperwork. He noticed Ruby approach the second puzzle box but did not interrupt. She sniffed the lid, circled it once, and sat down. For almost a minute she did nothing visible. Then she placed one paw against the side to stop the box from sliding. She lowered her nose to the small plastic latch, tested it from one direction, then the other. The latch clicked. Ruby lifted the panel and ate the food inside without looking toward anyone for approval. Michael watched her close the panel accidentally with her paw, then open it again with less hesitation. He wrote a note in the margin of her sheet. Independent problem solving observed during unstructured period. He did not change her rating. A single clever moment did not erase repeated failure under pressure. That was what Michael told himself, though another thought followed quietly behind it. Perhaps Ruby had not failed to understand the task. Perhaps she had refused to understand why so many people needed to watch her do it. That evening, Linda Parker arrived at Margaret's house for her first formal fitting. Michael returned with the puppies and found the sewing room transformed. Pins lined a magnetic tray. Pale thread lay in careful rows. The unfinished gown stood beneath 3 lamps, its 2 shades of white more visible now that the skirt had taken shape. Linda wore a cream blouse, pearl earrings, and tailored navy trousers. Her auburn gray hair had been arranged carefully around her face, but the precision of her appearance could not hide the tension in her mouth. Margaret helped her into the gown without unnecessary conversation. Linda studied herself in the long mirror and immediately asked for the neckline to be raised. Margaret pinned it without comment. Linda then asked whether the sleeves could be made longer. Margaret looked at her reflection. They can? And perhaps the skirt should be narrower. It can! Michael sat near the doorway with the evaluation forms, while Maisie explored a basket of fabric scraps. Ruby rested beneath a chair, watching the fitting from the shadows. Linda turned slightly and saw the warmer fabric along the lower skirt. Will that difference show in photographs? Yes, Margaret said. Can you disguise it? I can make it less obvious. That would be better. Margaret inserted another pin. Better for whom? Linda's expression tightened. For several seconds, only the soft clicking of Maisie's nails crossed the wooden floor. I don't want it to look foolish, Linda said at last. The fabric? Me. The admission changed the room. Linda kept her eyes on the mirror as though speaking to her own reflection required less courage than speaking to Margaret. People are already making jokes, she continued. A white dress at my age? A ceremony instead of a courthouse? Someone asked whether I planned to toss the bouquet or donate it to a museum. Margaret's face did not soften immediately. She had known Linda too long to confuse vulnerability with innocence. A person could be ashamed and still have caused harm. Both things could remain true. You are 68, Margaret said, not dead. Linda gave a quiet laugh, but her eyes filled. Margaret adjusted the shoulder seam. Women are often told to stop wanting beautiful things long before they have finished wanting them. That does not make the wanting foolish. Linda looked down at the dress. You make it sound simple. No, I make it sound permitted. Michael glanced toward Ruby. The puppy had moved closer without anyone noticing and was now lying near Linda's feet, not touching her, simply occupying the silence. Later that night, Michael decided to test whether the puppy's bond was interfering with their individual development. He placed Ruby's crate in the small room beside the kitchen and Maisie's crate in his bedroom at the opposite end of the hall. Each puppy had water, bedding, and the same evening meal. Ruby ate slowly, circled once, and lay beside the crate door. She remained awake for several minutes, listening, but did not cry. Maisie began pacing before Michael had turned off the light. She scratched at the crate, whined, then barked sharply toward the hallway. Michael sat nearby without opening the door. Maisie ignored the chew toy and refused the remaining food. Every few minutes she pressed her nose against the bars and listened for movement from the other room. The behavior continued past midnight. Michael had expected Ruby to be the one who struggled. Ruby followed Maisie through doorways, paused when Maisie moved out of sight, and stood behind her during crowded exercises. Michael had interpreted position as dependence. But dependence did not always stand behind. Sometimes it rushed ahead, gathered applause, and looked back only when the room became quiet. By morning, Maisie's bedding had been pushed into one corner from hours of restless movement. Ruby was awake but calm, lying with her chin near the door. Michael opened both crates. Maisie shot into the hallway, found Ruby, and pressed her entire body against her sister's side. Her tail moved rapidly, but the rest of her trembled with relief. Ruby stood still and allowed the contact. After several moments, Ruby stepped away, walked into the kitchen, and began drinking from the water bowl. Maisie followed. Michael remained in the hallway, holding both evaluation sheets. Ruby, the hesitant puppy, had endured the separation. Maisie, the confident favorite, had not. For the first time, Michael wondered whether the puppy who always led the way was not leading because she felt strongest. Perhaps she was simply more afraid of discovering that no one was behind her. The second week began under a harder Florida sun, with white heat gathering above the training yard and cicadas rasping in the palmettos beyond the fence. After Maisie's restless night and Ruby's unexpected calm, Michael divided their evaluations. He told himself the decision was procedural, not personal. Separate testing would reveal whether either puppy's behavior depended on the other. Yet as he carried 2 clipboards instead of 1, Michael felt the first thin crack in the certainty he had brought to Jacksonville. Maisie went outside with Daniel Price, a 27-year-old junior handler whose tall, narrow frame made every uniform look slightly oversized. Daniel had close-cropped blonde hair, pale skin that reddened quickly in the sun, and an open face that revealed every opinion before he spoke. He was patient with animals but eager around senior officers, a combination that often made him praise too quickly and challenge too slowly. Without Ruby nearby, Maisie attacked the obstacle course with her usual enthusiasm. She crossed the low bridge, pushed through hanging fabric, and chased a moving toy across the grass. But after every success, she turned toward the gate. When Ruby did not appear, Maisie's concentration loosened. She abandoned a retrieve halfway through and carried the toy toward the observation building instead. Daniel clapped once. Maisie immediately returned. "She works for the audience," he said. "She works for reinforcement," Michael corrected. Daniel looked as though he had more to say, but swallowed it. Michael disliked applause being treated as an emotional weakness. Working dogs performed for rewards, approval, play, food, or access. Motivation was not corruption. Still, when Daniel remained silent during the next attempt, Maisie dropped the toy and began searching the corners of the yard. Ruby's evaluation took place in a small, climate-controlled room with sound-dampened walls. Only Michael and Dr. Hannah Cole were present. Hannah, 36, was the facility's behavioral veterinarian, a compact black woman with deep brown skin, tightly braided hair gathered at the back of her neck, and dark eyes that rarely hurried to judgment. She spoke softly without sounding uncertain. Years earlier, Hannah had adopted a dog labeled unmanageable after 3 shelters failed to understand its fear of polished floors. The experience had made her suspicious of permanent conclusions drawn from temporary conditions. 3 metal containers stood along the wall. One held a cloth carrying a target scent. The others contained clean fabric. Michael allowed Ruby to enter without Maisie. Ruby paused at the threshold, glanced at Hannah, then inspected the room. No crowd shifted behind glass, no camera followed her face. After several seconds, Ruby moved toward the containers. She sniffed the first, passed the second, and stopped at the third. Her nose remained there. Michael marked the response. They rearranged the containers. Ruby found the correct one again. For a memory exercise, Hannah hid a red rubber object behind one of 4 low screens. Ruby watched once. After a short delay, she walked directly to the correct screen. "She's processing before acting," Hannah said. "She's slow to commit." Those are not always the same thing. Michael studied Ruby. The puppy did not look transformed. She was still cautious, still aware of the door, still unwilling to throw herself enthusiastically toward a command. But without an audience, her caution became organization. Ruby collected information before spending effort. Michael should have adjusted the assessment then. Instead, he decided Ruby needed controlled exposure to pressure. A specialized dog would not always work in silence. Rooms would be crowded, people would be impatient, equipment would move. Michael believed accommodation without adaptation could become another kind of limitation. The world could not be redesigned around one animal's discomfort. The following day, he brought 2 additional handlers into the room. Ruby hesitated but completed the first scent task. Michael shortened the waiting period before the second attempt. Ruby chose incorrectly. On the next session, 5 observers stood behind the glass. Michael reduced the response time again. Ruby sat down. He repeated the cue, sharper than before. Ruby looked toward the wall. Hannah folded her arms. She's telling us the pressure is interfering with the behavior. She has to learn to work through it. Then teach her. Don't simply increase what overwhelms her. Michael felt the old resistance rise in him. People often dressed avoidance in compassionate language. He had seen trainees ask for more preparation when what they needed was to act. Waiting could become a habit. Fear could become an authority if someone obeyed it often enough. He ordered another repetition. Daniel entered with a camera to document the session. Ruby's eyes followed the lens. Michael gave the signal. Ruby remained still. Ruby? The puppy lowered her body. Michael stepped closer and repeated the command with the same tone that had once carried across wind, engines, and men who could not afford hesitation. Ruby pressed herself against the floor, crawled toward the corner, and turned her face to the wall. The room became unpleasantly quiet. Daniel lowered the camera. Hannah moved toward Ruby, but Michael lifted one hand. Wait. For what? For her to re-engage. Ruby did not move. Hannah's expression hardened. There is a difference between teaching recovery and trapping an animal inside failure. Michael ended the session, though later than he should have. At Margaret's house, another kind of failure was waiting beneath warm lamplight. The gown lay across the sewing table, and Margaret sat before it with a seam ripper in one hand. Nearly 18 inches of stitching had wandered away from the marked line. Her swollen fingers struggled to grip the tiny tool. A silver needle lay on the floor beside her chair. Michael watched her remove 3 stitches, stop, flex her hand, then continue. You should leave it tonight, he said. Margaret did not look up. The dress does not know it is nighttime. That isn't what I meant. I know. The next afternoon, Michael arranged a solution. He ordered an electronic sewing machine with automatic threading, speed control, and a larger work surface. He also hired Jenna Morales for 3 mornings a week. Jenna was 24, short and athletic, with olive skin, thick black curls tied above her head, and quick brown eyes. She had studied costume design before leaving college to care for her mother after surgery. Jenna was cheerful without being careless, and respectful enough to wait outside when she realized Margaret had not been expecting her. Margaret opened the front door, looked at Jenna, then at the large delivery box behind her. What is this? Michael stepped forward. A machine that will reduce the strain on your hands. Jenna can handle the repetitive stitching while you supervise the design. Margaret's gaze settled on him. You arranged this? Yes. Without asking me? You needed help. Jenna shifted awkwardly. I can come back another time. There will not be another time, Margaret said, though her tone toward the young woman was gentler. This is not your fault. After Jenna left, Margaret turned toward Michael. The machine remained boxed between them like evidence. You are behind schedule, he said. Your hands are getting worse, and selling your old machine would leave you with nothing. I did not ask you to solve that. You were struggling. So was Ruby. The comparison struck him with irritating accuracy. Michael's jaw tightened. Pride is not a plan, Margaret, and control is not kindness. I was trying to preserve your work. No? You were deciding what part of my work still mattered. The machine, the method, the pace. You chose all of it because watching me struggle made you uncomfortable. He looked at her hands. You could damage them permanently. They are my hands. That does not make every decision wise. Margaret rose slowly. At full height, even slightly stooped, she carried the authority of someone who had spent decades placing pins close to nervous brides without ever drawing blood. You don't help me by deciding what I am allowed to keep, she said. You only make yourself the owner of my choices. Michael left the room before answering. Anger followed him down the hall, but beneath it lay something less comfortable.
At the facility, Ruby had turned toward a wall because he had decided discomfort was hers to endure.
At the house, Margaret had been expected to accept a machine, an assistant, and a new method because he had decided her old way was no longer practical. In both places, Michael had called the decision help. That evening, he drove back to the training center. Hannah was finishing records when he arrived. "I need the scent room," he said. "For another evaluation?" "For a correction." She studied his face, then handed him the key. Michael placed 3 scent containers on the floor. He brought Ruby in alone and asked Daniel, Hannah, and the night staff to leave. He turned off the camera. Then he removed his watch and set it beside the clipboard. Ruby went to the same corner and faced the wall. Michael sat on the floor several feet away. He did not call her. He did not offer food or repeat the cue. Minutes passed. The air conditioner whispered above them. Somewhere beyond the room, a kennel latch closed. After nearly 10 minutes, Ruby turned her head. Michael remained still. Ruby rose, stretched one front leg, and approached the containers. She sniffed the first, paused at the second, then touched her nose to the third. Correct. Michael made no sudden movement, no applause, no bright praise that might transform the room into another stage. He picked up his pen and wrote one clean mark beside Ruby's name. For the first time, it was not red. The 4th week opened beneath a bright Florida sky, with warm wind moving through the long grass beyond the training fences and the first heavy clouds of the wet season gathering far inland. Michael arrived at the facility before sunrise, with 2 separate evaluation plans tucked beneath his arm. The previous night with Ruby had not transformed him into a gentler man. It had done something more inconvenient. It had given him evidence he could no longer honestly ignore. He had spent most of his adult life believing that fairness meant applying the same standard to everyone. Now he was beginning to wonder whether identical treatment could become its own form of unfairness when the standard measured only one kind of strength. Maisie's assessment moved outdoors. Daniel Price set up a changing course across the main field, a canvas tunnel, a low platform, a rolling cart, 3 strangers positioned near the fence, and a sequence of objects that would be moved between attempts. Maisie entered with her tail high and her large black and tan paws striking the grass in excited, uneven steps. She noticed the unfamiliar people immediately and greeted each one as though they had arrived specifically to admire her. When Daniel rolled the cart across her path, Maisie startled, jumped sideways, then recovered within seconds and chased the moving wheel. When a cloth target was relocated from one corner of the field to another, she adjusted quickly. She made mistakes, but she rarely remained troubled by them. Michael watched her miss the correct turn, circle back, and complete the task with renewed enthusiasm. Maisie was not precise. She was resilient. She treated confusion as an invitation to keep moving. "She doesn't carry failure for long," Daniel said. Michael marked the observation. "That may matter more than speed." Daniel glanced at him, surprised by the answer. A week earlier, Michael would have corrected the younger handler for using language that sounded emotional rather than technical. Now he understood that people often created separate vocabularies for performance and feeling because admitting they were connected made evaluation less comfortable. Ruby's work remained inside the quiet scent room. Hannah placed 6 identical containers along the wall, 2 more than Ruby had previously encountered. One held a cloth carrying the target odor, another held a similar but incorrect scent intended to create confusion. Michael allowed Ruby a full minute to examine the room before giving the signal. Ruby moved slowly. Her folded ear shifted as she passed each container. She paused at the decoy, returned to it once, then continued. At the 5th container, she sat and touched it with her nose. Correct. The next arrangement placed the target near the entrance, where Ruby had previously been distracted by movement from the hallway. She noticed the doorway, but this time Michael stood farther back and did not repeat the cue. Ruby checked all 6 containers before returning to the first. Correct again. Maisie would have reached the target faster. Ruby reached it with fewer unnecessary choices. Over 3 days, the difference became impossible to dismiss. Maisie excelled when the environment changed, when strangers approached, and when a task required immediate action. Ruby performed best when the problem demanded observation, discrimination, and patience. Maisie repeated certain errors because enthusiasm carried her ahead of thought. Ruby took longer to begin, but rarely made the same mistake twice. Michael spread both evaluation charts across the conference table. For the first time, the numbers did not appear to describe a winner and a failure. They described two animals answering different questions. Thomas Reed entered carrying a folder stamped with the name of the program's largest private sponsor. His compact frame looked tighter than usual, and his sandy hair had been combed so carefully that Michael knew the conversation had little to do with dogs and much to do with money. The sponsor delegation arrives Saturday, Thomas said. They want a public demonstration. Michael kept his eyes on the charts. Both puppies? Maisie. That is not a complete evaluation. It is a demonstration, not a dissertation. Thomas opened the folder and slid a schedule across the table. The event included cameras, donors, several military families, and a short presentation about the future of the working dog program. The budget for the next training cycle had not yet been approved. They need to see progress, Thomas continued. Maisie gives them that. She is confident, visible, and easy to understand. Ruby's sense scores are stronger. In a silent room with 3 people, 6 containers, 2 competing odors. Thomas leaned back. Michael, no one writes checks because a puppy thinks carefully in private. The sentence stayed between them. Thomas was not cruel. Michael knew that. He had spent years stretching small budgets, protecting junior staff from cuts, and finding medical funding for dogs that no longer produced impressive reports. But pressure had taught him to translate value into whatever form a donor could recognize quickly. He did not dislike Ruby. He simply considered her difficult to explain. After Saturday, Thomas said, Maisie remains in the program. Ruby moves to the adoption list. We cannot keep paying to test every possibility. Michael looked through the conference room window. Outside, Maisie was attempting to carry 2 toys at once. Ruby sat beside the fence, watching the latch move each time the wind pushed the gate. You asked for 6 weeks, Michael said, and I am telling you the practical decision has already become clear. Michael could have challenged him. He had enough data to ask for more time, though not enough yet to promise Ruby another placement. He could have argued that cutting the process short made the original evaluation meaningless. Instead, he said nothing. Silence had protected Michael throughout much of his career. It allowed him to remain inside systems he privately questioned without being responsible for changing them. People often imagined obedience as loud, orders, boots, doors closing. But some of the strongest obedience entered a room quietly and sat down without objecting. That afternoon, he took both puppies back to Margaret's house. Linda had arranged another fitting, this time with 2 friends who wanted to see the dress before the final alterations. The sewing room felt crowded before everyone had even entered. One of Linda's friends was Evelyn Grant, a 70-year-old retired elementary school librarian with a small, delicate frame, warm brown skin, and silver hair shaped into soft curls around her face. Evelyn dressed neatly in lavender slacks and a pearl-buttoned blouse, but she carried a folded paper fan despite the air conditioning. She was kind, observant, and easily embarrassed by any attention directed toward her health. Since a fainting episode at a church luncheon the previous summer, she had become frightened of appearing fragile in public, which often caused her to hide discomfort until it became worse. Linda stood on the fitting platform while Margaret pinned the warmer fabric into the skirt. Maisie circulated happily among the guests, accepting affection from every available hand. Ruby remained near the doorway, watching the movement of bodies, the swing of the measuring tape, and the mirrored reflections that doubled the number of people in the room. Linda studied herself and asked Margaret to narrow the waist. Margaret refused. The dress must allow you to breathe. I intend to breathe very elegantly. You may do it elegantly, but you will still do it." The women laughed, and Maisie barked as though contributing. Evelyn laughed too, then lifted her fan. The room had grown warm beneath the lamps. Her smile became fixed, and the color around her mouth began to fade. Michael noticed her grip the back of a chair. "Are you all right?" Linda asked. That question brought every face toward Evelyn. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Margaret stepped down from the platform. Another friend offered water. Linda reached for Evelyn's arm. Michael moved the chair closer. 3 people spoke at once, each attempting to help, each making the room feel smaller. Evelyn's breathing shortened. She tried to wave them away, but the attention tightened around her like another layer of clothing she could not remove. "Give her space," Michael said, though his own voice added to the noise. Ruby crossed the room. The puppy did not jump against Evelyn's legs or push into the cluster of hands. She stopped several feet away, turned once, and lowered herself onto the floor. Her body rested loosely, her chin between her paws. She looked at Evelyn without staring. The room gradually quieted. Evelyn's eyes settled on Ruby. The puppy breathed in a slow, visible rhythm, her narrow sides rising and falling. Evelyn watched one breath, then another. Her own shoulders began to lower. Linda released her arm. Margaret motioned for everyone else to step back. After a minute, Evelyn accepted the glass of water. Ruby remained where she was. She had performed no command. She had not detected a scent, crossed an obstacle, or impressed anyone with speed. She had simply recognized that the crowded room did not need another creature rushing forward. Michael watched Evelyn breathe more steadily. Ruby had offered no rescue, only less pressure. And sometimes, Michael realized, that was the first useful thing anyone had thought to give. Saturday arrived, bright and windless, the kind of Florida morning that made every surface look newly polished. White folding chairs lined the edge of the training field, banners moved only slightly above the fence, and camera lenses pointed toward the course before the first puppy had entered it. The demonstration had been described as an opportunity to show progress, but Michael understood what it truly was. Progress did not need catered coffee, printed programs, or donors seated according to the size of their contributions. This was a performance designed to turn uncertainty into something attractive enough to fund. The sponsor delegation was led by Elaine Brooks, a 63-year-old foundation director with a slender, upright figure, smooth brown skin, and silver hair worn in a precise, cropped style. Elaine dressed in a pale blue suit despite the heat and carried no handbag. Only a leather folder held against her ribs. She had spent 20 years raising money for veteran programs after her older son returned from service with injuries that changed the shape of his adult life. The experience had made her generous but impatient with vague promises. She wanted figures, results, and visible proof that money became action rather than another well-written report. Thomas Reed greeted Elaine with a warmth Michael rarely saw him display. Thomas's smile was not false, but it was carefully measured. Every handshake carried the next training cycle inside it. Margaret sat in the second row beneath a wide straw hat. She wore a linen dress the color of faded sage, and her swollen hands rested around the head of a wooden cane she rarely used at home. She had not come because she trusted the program. She had come because Ruby had once lain quietly at Evelyn's feet when everyone else had mistaken urgency for usefulness. Margaret wanted to see whether the people judging the puppy could recognize the same thing. Maisie entered first. The applause began before she completed the opening task. She raced through the tunnel, climbed the platform, ignored a rolling cart, and located a cloth toy hidden behind stacked barriers. Her turns were too wide, and she nearly missed the final marker, but she recovered with such enthusiasm that the audience laughed instead of noticing the error. Maisie loved them for it. Her black saddle shone beneath the sun, her large ears stood more evenly than they had a week earlier, and every cheer seemed to lift her legs higher. She returned to Michael with the toy, dropped it at his boots, then looked beyond him toward the chairs. Michael gave her the reward. Maisie looked at the audience again. Thomas leaned toward Elaine and said something that made her smile. Michael could not hear the words, but he knew their shape: confidence, adaptability, future potential. Maisie completed the second sequence with only one missed cue. Daniel Price reset the equipment while several photographers moved closer to the fence. One of them was Leo Harris, a broad-shouldered 48-year-old man with a shaved head, a graying beard, and a permanent crease between his brows from years of looking through viewfinders. Leo had covered military charities long enough to understand that a single photograph could raise more money than 10 pages of careful explanation. He was not dishonest, but he favored moments that could be understood without captions. Maisie gave him several. When her session ended, the audience applauded loudly enough that she tried to return to the course. Then Ruby was brought out. The difference was immediate. Ruby's darker face lifted toward the chairs. She noticed the cameras, the unfamiliar shoes along the fence, the movement of servers carrying trays behind the last row. One ear stood, the folded tip of the other leaned outward. Her body did not collapse, but it became smaller, every muscle drawing inward as if she were trying to reduce the amount of herself available for examination. Michael felt the leash change before Ruby stopped walking. He had asked Thomas to limit the audience during Ruby's demonstration. Thomas had agreed in the loose manner of a man agreeing to weather he could not control. Now, more than 40 people watched from the chairs, with another dozen standing near the fence. Michael looked toward Hannah. She stood beside the equipment table, her arms folded, concern visible in the stillness of her face. He could end the demonstration. He could tell Elaine that Ruby's strongest work happened under different conditions and show the recorded scent results instead. He could explain that testing an animal meant creating an environment that measured ability rather than merely provoking weakness. But Maisie's success still hung over the field. Thomas was watching. The cameras were ready. Michael felt the old instinct to protect the structure around him, even when the structure had begun asking him to betray what he knew. He brought Ruby to the scent line. 3 containers had been placed across the grass. The task was simpler than the one Ruby had completed indoors. Michael gave the signal. Ruby looked toward a camera shutter clicking near the fence. She did not move. Michael waited 3 seconds. The audience became attentive in a different way. Maisie's mistakes had produced affection. Ruby's stillness produced discomfort. People wanted animals to fail noisily because noise made failure look temporary. Silence made everyone wonder whether the problem was deeper. Michael repeated the command. Ruby lowered her head. Leo adjusted his position. A woman in the front row whispered to her husband. Thomas tapped his pen against the program. Michael felt heat collect beneath his collar. He knew Ruby was overloaded. He had seen the exact progression before: scanning, stillness, withdrawal. He also knew what the audience saw: a dog refusing a simple instruction while the man responsible for evaluating her stood without an answer. "Ruby," he said again, his voice sharper. The puppy's paws remained fixed. Michael tightened the leash, not enough to hurt her, only enough to guide her forward. That was the excuse he formed immediately. Guidance, a small correction, a reminder that movement was expected. Ruby took 1 step and pressed herself flat against the grass, her face turned away from the containers. The field fell quiet. Hannah moved closer. "Michael." He heard the warning in her voice, but he also heard Thomas's earlier words. No one writes checks because a puppy thinks carefully in private. Michael released the leash pressure and looked toward Elaine. Her expression remained composed, though the leather folder had lowered slightly in her hands. "This response confirms a concern we have been monitoring," Michael said. The sentence came out steady. That made it worse. "Ruby has demonstrated difficulty maintaining engagement in active environments. At this stage, she does not show the stability required for specialized operational work." He did not say she had identified competing scents more accurately than Maisie. He did not say the demonstration had recreated the precise condition under which she struggled. He did not explain that he had known what would happen and proceeded anyway. The words were technically defensible. They were also untrue in the larger way that mattered.
Daniel lifted Ruby carefully and carried her from the field. The puppy did not resist. Her head rested against his arm, eyes open but distant. Michael glanced toward the second row. Margaret's chair was empty. The rest of the presentation continued. Maisie returned for photographs. Elaine asked practical questions about staffing and long-term costs.
Thomas answered smoothly. Michael stood beside them and felt as though he were watching a uniformed stranger use his voice. By the time he returned to St. Augustine, afternoon rain had begun tapping against the windows of Margaret's house. A cardboard box sat open in the sewing room. Margaret was wrapping her old mechanical sewing machine in a faded quilt. The machine was heavy, cream-colored, and worn smooth near the hand wheel. Michael had seen Margaret touch it with the familiarity people reserved for objects that had witnessed more of their lives than most relatives. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Selling it." "You refused the new one." "I refused your decision. That does not make this one less necessary." Margaret folded the quilt over the machine. Her fingers trembled with the effort. She told him the truth without decorating it. The money Linda was paying would not cover the remaining debt from the final years of her husband's illness. Insurance had paid for treatment, but not transportation, home modifications, or the months Margaret had stopped working to care for him. She had protected her children from the details because they had their own mortgages, their own illnesses, their own pride. Michael looked at the machine. "How much remains?" "That is not your concern." "I can pay it." Margaret's hands stopped. "No. It would solve the problem. It would solve your discomfort. You are selling the last working piece of the business you built, and it is mine to sell. You don't have to do this." Margaret turned toward him. Her eyes were tired, not soft. "Do you want to help me, Michael? Or do you want every problem near you to disappear quickly so you never have to feel helpless?" He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Margaret looked toward the rain-streaked window. "You did the same thing today. Ruby made the room uncomfortable, so you gave everyone a conclusion. You turned uncertainty into a verdict because a verdict made you look in control." Michael felt the shame arrive without drama. It did not strike like lightning. It settled inside him like something heavy taking its rightful place. He found Ruby in the sewing room beneath the unfinished gown. The warmer white fabric hung above her like a low shelter. Maisie stood nearby with a braided cloth toy in her mouth. She dropped it near Ruby's paws and nudged it forward. Ruby did not move. Maisie tried again, then lay down several feet away. Michael sat outside the doorway. He did not reach beneath the gown. He did not call Ruby's name or offer food. For once, he understood that an apology could become another demand if the wounded one was expected to respond. Rain whispered against the glass. After a long while, Michael spoke. "You did not ruin the test today." Ruby kept her face turned away. Michael removed the stopwatch from his pocket. He looked at the scratched metal case, at the button he had pressed hundreds of times to convert living effort into numbers. He placed it inside the desk drawer and closed it. "I used you to prove I could not be wrong." Ruby did not forgive him. She did not crawl into his lap or lift her head at the sound of regret. She simply remained beneath the unfinished dress while Michael sat outside it, finally learning that telling the truth did not guarantee immediate comfort. Monday arrived beneath a low ceiling of silver clouds, and the air outside Jacksonville carried the damp weight of rain that had not yet fallen. Michael Turner entered Captain Thomas Reed's office before the first training session, carrying Ruby's evaluation folder in one hand and Maisie's in the other. He had spent most of Sunday reviewing every score, video, and handwritten observation from the previous weeks. The evidence did not absolve him. It made his failure clearer. Ruby had not hidden her abilities. Michael had simply valued the conditions under which Maisie succeeded more than the conditions under which Ruby did. Thomas sat behind a desk crowded with funding reports. He looked tired, his sandy hair less carefully arranged than it had been for the sponsor demonstration. "You already made the recommendation publicly," Thomas said after Michael asked for more time. I made an incomplete statement under pressure. You called the dog unstable. I described her performance in one environment as if it defined her in every environment. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The adoption transfer is scheduled for Friday. Delay it 10 days. For what? To finish the evaluation we claimed we were conducting. Thomas leaned back. And if the answer remains the same? Then the answer remains the same for honest reasons. The words sounded simple, but Michael knew honesty often became expensive only after someone had built a comfortable system around avoiding it. Thomas looked toward the window, where Maisie was chasing a fluttering leaf beside Daniel. 10 days, he said, no more. The program still selects one puppy. Michael accepted the condition without pretending it solved everything. He designed 2 separate assessment tracks. Maisie's work took place outdoors and in active indoor spaces where people moved unpredictably. Daniel changed the position of obstacles between attempts, introduced unfamiliar handlers, rolled carts across her path, and interrupted familiar routines with new signals. Maisie made mistakes, but she recovered almost immediately. When a stranger accidentally dropped a metal clipboard behind her, she jumped, spun around, then approached the object with her tail rising again. When one route was blocked, she searched for another without waiting for Michael to solve the problem. Maisie's strength was not obedience in the narrow sense. It was social courage. She entered disorder as though it might contain a game. Ruby's assessment moved into a controlled scent laboratory borrowed from a civilian research center. Hannah prepared cloth samples carrying odors separated by only slight chemical differences. The tasks required patience rather than speed. Ruby was given time to inspect the room before each trial, and no one repeated a cue once it had been delivered. During the first test, Ruby checked 8 identical containers and identified the target correctly. During the second, she rejected a stronger but incorrect odor and returned to a faint sample near the far wall. On the third day, Michael introduced a delayed search. Ruby smelled the target, waited in another room for 15 minutes, then entered a rearranged space and found the matching sample without returning to a previous error. Her pace remained slow, her accuracy did not. Michael recorded every result, including the failures. Ruby sometimes stopped when a door opened unexpectedly. Maisie sometimes rushed past a target because the nearest person laughed. Neither puppy became perfect simply because Michael had begun seeing them differently. On the 4th day, Dr. Patricia Moore arrived for an independent evaluation. Patricia was 60, tall and long-limbed, with deep umber skin, close-cropped silver hair, and rectangular glasses that rested low on a narrow, thoughtful face. She wore a charcoal blouse, practical trousers, and shoes without polished surfaces because she disliked anything that announced authority before competence had earned it. Patricia had spent 27 years developing civilian scent dogs for agricultural inspection, medical research, and controlled laboratory work. Earlier in her career, she had lost a promising dog after a training supervisor repeatedly forced it through crowded demonstrations to satisfy donors. Since then, Patricia had become blunt about the difference between preparing an animal for difficulty and demanding that it succeed inside the wrong environment. She watched Maisie first. The puppy completed a moving search course while volunteers crossed the room carrying bags and rolling equipment. Maisie missed one scent point, accepted a redirection, and finished without losing enthusiasm. She borrows energy from people, Patricia observed. That can become distraction, but it can also become endurance. Then Patricia watched Ruby in the scent laboratory. She did not speak during the trial. Ruby examined 10 containers, paused twice, and selected the correct sample. Patricia changed the order and added a competing odor. Ruby took longer but remained accurate. Afterward, Patricia sat with Michael and Hannah in the observation room. She removed her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her blouse. "Ruby is not a strong candidate for high-intensity military work," she said. Michael felt the disappointment before he could stop it.
Some part of him had wanted Patricia to prove everyone else entirely wrong. Patricia continued, "That does not make the original judgment correct.
It makes the category wrong."
She explained that Ruby's caution could become dangerous in fast operational settings where immediate response mattered. But in a controlled laboratory, agricultural facility, or medical research program, the same caution could support reliable discrimination between subtle odors. Ruby did not rush toward the first likely answer. She checked, reconsidered, and corrected herself. People enjoy the idea that every overlooked creature is secretly extraordinary at everything, Patricia said. That is another form of refusing to see the animal in front of us. Ruby does not need to become Maisie with better lighting. Ruby needs work designed for Ruby. Michael looked through the window at the two puppies resting in separate pens. Maisie slept on her back, paws loose in the air. Ruby lay upright, watching a technician replace labels on the containers. "What would you recommend?" he asked. "A civilian scent development trial, 3 months?"
"No guarantee."
Michael nodded. No guarantee was more honest than a sentimental rescue. That evening he returned to Margaret's house and found Linda standing beside the sewing table with an old newspaper folded beneath one arm. She wore no pearls and no carefully arranged jacket, only a soft gray blouse and plain black slacks. Without the armor of elegance, she looked smaller and older. Margaret sat near the unfinished gown. The mechanical sewing machine remained on the table, still unsold. Linda placed the newspaper between them. The article had yellowed around the edges. A photograph showed Linda at 38, beside a bridal gown with a high curved collar and layered sleeves. The caption praised her originality and called the design the beginning of a new regional style. Margaret's name did not appear. "I kept this," Linda said. Margaret did not touch it. "I know what it says." The reporter assumed I designed it. "You let her?" Linda lowered her eyes.
"Yeah." The room held no dramatic revelation. Margaret had known the truth for 30 years. The wound did not become deeper because the person who caused it had finally learned to name the knife. "I did not steal your drawings," Linda said. "I told myself that mattered. It mattered to you. I thought I would correct it later. Then the article brought clients. By the time I understood what my silence had done, correcting it would have cost me something." Margaret looked at her steadily. "So you waited until the cost belonged mostly to me?" Linda's eyes filled, but Margaret did not rescue her from the sentence. "I am sorry," Linda said. "Not because I need this dress. Not because I want the wedding to feel clean. I am sorry because I allowed people to build my success on work they believed was mine." Margaret finally touched the edge of the newspaper. "It does not return 30 years, she said. "I know. But perhaps it can keep the 31st from becoming the same." That was not forgiveness. It was a boundary with a door left unlocked. Linda looked toward the gown. "Keep both fabrics." Margaret raised one eyebrow. "Do not hide the difference," Linda said. "Make it part of the dress." For the next hour, Margaret marked a new line along the skirt. Instead of burying the seam beneath folds, she curved it deliberately from the waist toward the hem. The cool white silk met the warmer ivory in a narrow, visible path that made the skirt appear to turn differently beneath the light. Maisie settled beside the brighter fabric. Ruby chose the warmer section and rested her dark muzzle on its edge. Michael stood behind them with the evaluation charts tucked beneath his arm. "Perhaps the question was never which one was better," he said. Margaret guided the needle through the final section where the two fabrics met. "No," she replied. "The question is why you kept asking them to prove they were the same." The final evaluation day arrived beneath a clear coastal sky, with sunlight resting sharply on the windows of the administration building, and a warm breeze bending the sawgrass beyond the fence. Michael Turner entered the conference room carrying 2 folders, a flash drive, and none of the certainty he had worn so comfortably 6 weeks earlier. Maisie and Ruby waited in separate shaded pens outside. Maisie stood with her front paws against the gate, ready to greet whoever appeared. Ruby sat farther back, watching a maintenance worker move a cart along the walkway. Neither puppy knew that several adults were about to translate weeks of behavior into a few sentences that might determine where each of them would live. The review board consisted of Thomas Reed, Dr. Hannah Cole, Patricia Moore, Elaine Brooks from the sponsoring foundation, and Commander Rachel Sloan, the officer overseeing the regional training programs. Rachel was 53, tall and broad-shouldered, with pale, freckled skin, iron-gray hair cut just below her ears, and a long face made more severe by straight eyebrows and a narrow mouth. A healed burn scar climbed from beneath her left collar toward the side of her neck. Rachel had earned a reputation for being exacting without being theatrical. Early in her career, she had approved an expensive training project because senior officers favored it, only to watch the program fail after junior staff had been too intimidated to report its flaws. Since then, she distrusted both emotional speeches and confident presentations that contained no inconvenient facts. Michael stood at the end of the table. Thomas had asked him the previous evening to keep the presentation simple. Select Maisie, explain Ruby's limitations, and avoid discussing the sponsor demonstration unless someone raised it first. Michael began with Maisie. He showed footage of her working around moving equipment, unfamiliar handlers, sudden sounds, and changing routes. Maisie missed targets when excitement carried her too quickly, but she accepted redirection and returned to work without holding on to the mistake. Maisie demonstrates strong environmental recovery, social confidence, and willingness to re-engage after disruption, Michael said. She seeks human interaction and performs best in active settings. The same qualities that make Maisie distractible can be developed into endurance and adaptability. Thomas relaxed slightly. Elaine reviewed the chart in front of her. Michael recommended Maisie for continued development in the Navy Working Dog program. Then he opened Ruby's folder. The first chart contained her original scores: hesitation, low engagement, inconsistent response under observation. The second chart showed her later scent work: accuracy across repeated trials, delayed recognition, resistance to competing odors, and a lower rate of repeated mistakes. Ruby is not an appropriate candidate for high-intensity military work, Michael said. Thomas gave a small nod, expecting the conclusion to end there. Michael continued. Ruby's slower initiation and sensitivity to crowded environments could become operational risks in conditions that require immediate action. However, those limitations do not support the conclusion that Ruby lacks specialized working ability. He showed the recordings from the controlled laboratory. Ruby moved through 8 containers, paused at a competing odor, rejected it, and selected the correct sample. In another clip, she remembered a target after a 15-minute delay. Patricia presented a written offer for a 3-month civilian trial in her scent development program. The program worked with agricultural inspections and medical research facilities, where dogs operated in carefully controlled environments and distinguished subtle odors. There is no guarantee of placement after the trial, Patricia said. Her voice remained calm and unsentimental. Ruby may still fail. What I am offering is a relevant test, not a charitable hiding place. Elaine looked toward Michael. Why was this ability absent from the public demonstration? The question Michael had known was coming still tightened his chest. It was not absent, he said. It was excluded by the structure of the demonstration. Thomas shifted in his chair. The event was intended to show performance under active conditions in which we already knew Ruby struggled. We were evaluating suitability for this program. We were also presenting a predetermined answer as though it were new information. The room became very still. Michael looked toward Rachel Sloan rather than Thomas. My initial evaluation was flawed. I treated speed, social boldness, and public compliance as the full definition of working potential. When Ruby performed differently in quieter conditions, I increased pressure instead of questioning whether the test was measuring the ability I claimed it measured. Thomas placed both hands on the table. You made the recommendation at the demonstration. I did. In front of the Foundation. Yes. And now you are saying the program's methods produced a misleading result? I am saying my use of those methods produced one. Thomas's anger was controlled, which made it more dangerous. Do you understand what that admission could do to sponsor confidence? Michael did. Funding paid for staff, veterinary care, equipment, and dogs that would otherwise never receive training. The truth did not float above practical consequences. It arrived carrying invoices. But practical harm did not make a false conclusion honest. A system that protects its reputation by ignoring unfavorable evidence is not reliable, Michael said. It is only well defended. Elaine closed her folder. Her expression revealed neither approval nor offense. Rachel asked, "Are you requesting that Ruby remain in the Navy program?" No. Are you asking us to fund an unsuitable military candidate because you feel responsible for mishandling her? No. I am recommending Maisie for the role Maisie is suited to, and releasing Ruby to a civilian trial for which she has supporting data. Ruby should not remain here to make me feel forgiven. Rachel studied him for a long moment. That is the first useful distinction made this morning. The board asked Michael to wait outside while they deliberated. Across St. Augustine, Margaret's garden was filling with folding chairs, pale flowers, and neighbors carrying covered dishes. Linda Parker's wedding was deliberately small. He had chosen no bridal party, no aisle runner, and no music loud enough to require conversation afterward. The groom, George Whitman, was 71, a retired pharmacist with a gentle round face, thinning white hair, and large hands that seemed permanently ready to hold something breakable. George had lost his wife 8 years earlier and had spent the first 5 years afterward refusing every invitation that implied life might continue. He possessed a quiet sense of humor and a habit of listening until other people discovered what they had actually meant to say. Linda stood in Margaret's bedroom wearing the finished gown. The cool white silk and warmer ivory fabric met in a visible curved line from the waist to the hem. Rather than looking patched, the dress seemed to shift as Linda moved, one shade catching the light while the other softened it. Margaret stood behind her, attempting to fasten the row of small fabric-covered buttons. Her swollen fingers completed 3 before pain tightened across her knuckles. She tried a 4th, dropped the button loop, and pressed her hands against the edge of the dresser. Linda saw her face in the mirror. "We can use the zipper underneath." The buttons were designed to close. "Margaret, I can do it." The sentence carried less confidence than habit. For years, Margaret had treated independence like a locked door. After her husband became ill, people had entered her life with advice, schedules, and opinions about what she could manage. Refusing assistance became the one territory she still controlled. But control could turn into ritual long after the original threat had passed. Margaret reached for her phone. Jenna Morales arrived 15 minutes later, dressed for the wedding in a sunflower yellow dress, her black curls gathered loosely behind her head. She had brought a small sewing kit out of habit. Margaret handed her the button hook. "I need you to finish these," Margaret said. Jenna did not smile too broadly or praise her for asking. "All right." Margaret remained beside her, directing the spacing and checking the fall of the fabric. She had not surrendered the work. She had chosen which hands would help complete it. When Linda stepped into the garden, the line between the two whites remained visible in full daylight. No guest laughed. George looked at her as though age had not reduced beauty but given him more years with which to recognize it. At the training facility, the conference room door opened after nearly 40 minutes. Rachel invited Michael back inside. The board approved Maisie's continuation in the Navy development program. Ruby would be released into Patricia's 3-month civilian evaluation under a formal transfer agreement. Elaine agreed that the Foundation would not withdraw funding, though she requested a written review of the assessment process. "This does not guarantee Ruby a working placement," Rachel said. "I understand. And your admission will become part of the review." "It should." Thomas did not look at Michael when the meeting ended. Michael arrived at Margaret's house after the ceremony. Guests had already begun eating beneath strings of small white lights. Maisie and Ruby rested in separate exercise pens near the garden, both tired from the day. Michael stopped outside the open gate. Margaret noticed him from across the yard. She was seated beside Linda, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. One empty chair stood nearby. "Don't stand there as if someone threw you out," Margaret called. Several guests turned. Michael remained by the gate. Margaret pointed toward the chair. "But do not assume the seat automatically belongs to you either." Michael crossed the garden and sat down only after she moved her sewing basket from the cushion. Maisie lifted her head at the sight of him. Ruby watched without approaching. For once, Michael did not call either puppy closer. He had spent years confusing responsibility with possession, assistance with authority, and being necessary with being valued. Now he sat among people whose lives he had not repaired, and beside two animals whose futures would not belong to him. Being welcomed, he finally understood, was not the same as owning the place where one had been invited to sit. 8 months later, early spring returned to northeastern Florida with warm rain, bright azaleas, and salt wind slipping inland from the Atlantic. The seasons had changed almost without asking permission, as seasons often did, leaving people to decide whether they had changed with them or merely learned to describe the same habits differently. Near Jacksonville, Maisie had entered advanced development in the Navy working dog program. She was no longer the awkward 11-week-old puppy whose paws seemed too large for her body. At nearly 10 months old, Maisie had grown into a lean young German shepherd with a strong black saddle, tan legs, and ears that now stood evenly above her alert face. She remained social, energetic, and shamelessly delighted by attention. Applause could still pull one ear away from a task, and an unfamiliar person carrying a toy remained, in Maisie's opinion, a possible new best friend. But she had learned to return to work without searching every doorway for Ruby. During a complex course involving moving carts, multiple handlers, and changing routes, Maisie lost focus when a group of visitors clapped. She turned toward them, tail lifting, then looked back at Michael before he gave another command. For 1 second, the old Maisie and the developing Maisie stood inside the same body. Then she returned to the scent marker and completed the search. Michael did not celebrate loudly. He marked the recovery and allowed himself a small smile. Progress, he had learned, was not the disappearance of an old tendency. Sometimes it was the pause in which a different choice became possible. Ruby had changed in less visible ways. She had completed Patricia Moore's 3-month civilian trial and remained in the scent development program, where researchers were studying how trained dogs might distinguish subtle odor patterns in controlled agricultural and medical settings. Ruby had grown narrower and slightly smaller than Maisie, with a dark, thoughtful face and one ear whose tip still folded when she concentrated. She continued to dislike crowded rooms. Some mornings she entered the laboratory, surveyed every technician, and needed several minutes before beginning. Patricia did not pretend those delays were charming. They remained limitations that required planning. But once Ruby began, she worked with remarkable care. She rejected strong decoy odors, remembered samples after long intervals, and rarely repeated an error after correction. The quality once labeled hesitation had become discernment when placed inside work that respected the difference. Michael visited both programs, but he no longer arrived as though his presence completed the room. He remained involved in Maisie's development and reviewed Ruby's reports with Patricia, yet he understood that neither dog belonged to the version of himself who had first evaluated them. Maisie trusted several handlers. Ruby often preferred Patricia and sometimes ignored Michael entirely when he visited. The first time Ruby walked past him to sit beside a laboratory technician, Michael felt the old, unreasonable sting of being unnecessary. He recognized it, allowed it to exist, and did not turn it into anyone else's obligation. Caring for a living creature did not create a debt of affection. That truth was less comforting than ownership and far more honest. Once each month, Patricia brought Ruby to Margaret's blue house in St. Augustine, while Michael arranged for Maisie to spend the afternoon there. The reunions were never quiet. Maisie usually spotted Ruby first and charged across the back lawn with all the dignity of a falling laundry basket. Ruby braced for impact, corrected Maisie with a sharp bark when the greeting became too rough, then chased her beneath the live oaks. They stole each other's toys, argued over the same water bowl despite having two, and occasionally fell asleep with their backs touching beneath Margaret's sewing room table. Yet when evening arrived and separate vehicles waited outside, neither dog panicked. Maisie left with her handler after one backward glance. Ruby climbed into Patricia's vehicle without scratching at the door. Their bond had not weakened. It had stopped being the only structure holding them upright. Margaret's life had also widened without becoming unrecognizable. Linda publicly corrected the archived records connected to the bridal collection from 30 years earlier. She contacted the regional magazine, provided old sketches and correspondence, and asked that Margaret Ellis be listed as the principal designer. The correction appeared in a modest column few people noticed, without the dramatic apology younger Margaret might once have imagined. It did not restore lost clients, income, or years. Justice rarely arrived with enough force to recreate what had been taken. Still, Margaret clipped the correction and placed it beside the original article, not because the two pieces of paper balanced each other, but because truth deserved a place even when it arrived late and wearing sensible shoes. Margaret did not sell her old mechanical sewing machine. Instead, she opened the sewing room every Thursday afternoon to 6 older women from the neighborhood. Some had sewn for decades. Others could barely thread a needle. They came with arthritis, failing eyesight, unfinished hems, fabric inherited from dead mothers, and opinions about tea strong enough to end friendships. Margaret refused to call the gathering a healing circle. She said it was a sewing class, although very little sewing occurred during the first hour. Jenna Morales helped when invited, not when assumed. She cut difficult patterns, carried the heavy machine when the table needed moving, and accepted Margaret's instructions without turning assistance into a ceremony. The women did not produce perfect work. One sleeve emerged shorter than the other. A floral table runner leaned so dramatically to the left that Margaret declared it had developed political beliefs. Laughter entered the room without anyone claiming it had repaired them. Some losses remained losses. Some hands continued to hurt. But tea stayed hot, fabric accumulated in cheerful piles, and no one was required to pretend every seam ran straight. Michael continued evaluating younger dogs at the facility. His methods did not become soft. Dogs intended for demanding work still had to meet real standards, and he rejected the sentimental idea that every animal possessed a hidden gift waiting for the right inspirational speech. Some dogs were unsuitable for specialized training. Some evaluations ended in disappointment. But before each test, Michael now asked what the exercise was truly measuring. Was it measuring scent ability or willingness to work in front of strangers? Was it measuring recovery or merely rewarding speed? Was the environment necessary to the role, or had everyone repeated it so long that the method had become confused with the purpose? Thomas Reed never offered Michael an easy reconciliation. Their professional relationship remained formal, though the program adopted a review process requiring evaluators to document whether testing conditions matched the role being assessed. Elaine Brooks continued funding the program, but her foundation requested clearer reporting on unsuccessful candidates and alternative placements. No one described those changes as revolutionary. Most lasting corrections entered institutions through new forms, longer meetings, and people complaining that the old way had been simpler. On Linda and George's first wedding anniversary, they returned to Margaret's house for dinner. Linda brought the gown in a garment bag because a small section of thread near the lower seam had loosened. Margaret hung it beside the sewing room window, where the late afternoon light passed through the cool white silk and the warmer ivory panel. Instead of hiding the difference, the sunlight made both shades more visible. Maisie lay on the left side of the gown, chewing a length of ribbon she had almost certainly stolen. Ruby rested on the right, watching Maisie with the resigned expression of a dog who had predicted a minor disaster and intended to be present when it happened. Between them was a space wide enough for one chair.
Michael entered carrying a box of pastries and stopped. Margaret looked up from the loose thread. "Are you waiting for permission?" Michael studied the space between the dogs. Months earlier, he would have sat without thinking. Before that, he might have called both puppies to him and mistaken their response for proof that the place belonged to him. "No," he said. "I'm checking whether that seat is actually meant for me." Margaret laughed. At last, a decent question. Michael placed the pastries on the table and sat down. Maisie rolled sideways until one shoulder rested against his boot. Ruby remained where she was, several feet away. No one called her closer. Outside, rain began softly against the leaves. Inside, Margaret drew the needle through the loose section of the wedding gown. The two shades of white did not blend into one. They did not conceal each other or end at the same point, yet both belonged to the design, each holding a different side of the seam. Maisie and Ruby no longer needed to live the same life to remain connected. Michael no longer needed to own their futures to know his concern had been real. Margaret's hands still hurt. Linda's correction had arrived 30 years late. Ruby might never enjoy a crowded room, and Maisie might always glance toward applause. Nothing had become perfect. But when the thread tightened, the dress held, and for the people and animals gathered beneath it, that was not a lesser ending, it was simply an honest one. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as thunder, perfect answers, or lives suddenly repaired. Sometimes they appear as a second chance to look again. Michael nearly judged Ruby by the wrong standard. Margaret nearly believed needing help meant losing her independence. Linda allowed silence to protect her success for 30 years. Each of them shows how easily people confuse confidence with strength, speed with ability, and control with love. In everyday life, we often measure others by how well they fit our expectations. We call quiet people weak, cautious people difficult, and those who need a different path unsuccessful. But God does not create every soul for the same purpose. What looks like a flaw in one place may become a gift in another. Real love does not force two lives onto the same road. It gives each one room to grow and remains present without demanding ownership. Share this story with someone who may feel judged by the wrong standard. Tell us in the comments what Ruby's journey meant to you, and subscribe for more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you with wisdom to see hidden worth, courage to admit when you are wrong, and grace to let others become who they were created to be.